Hi, and thanks for staying on. July 17th marks the 12th anniversary of the downing of Malaysia Airlines flight MH17. On this date, 12 years ago, all 298 passengers and crew were killed when the civilian aircraft was shot down over eastern Ukraine. As the nation remembers the victims, we honor their memory and extend our thoughts to the families and loved ones who continue to bear this profound loss. And with that, here is what's coming up on this edition of The World. Later on the program, I speak with Steve KILLELEA AM, founder and executive chairman of the Institute for Economics and Peace, as he takes us through the findings of the Global Peace Index 2026. Also, in just a bit, psychologist Dr. JAYN RAJANDRAN joins me to discuss the changing world of work and how evolving workplace expectations are reshaping careers and well-being. I'm PASHA RAHIM. You're watching The World on Bernama TV. Around the world, artificial intelligence, economic uncertainty, and changing workforce expectations are reshaping the way organizations operate. As organizations adapt, people are also being asked to work differently than ever before. So how is the changing world of work affecting people, and are we keeping up? Joining us to discuss this is Dr. JAYN RAJANDRAN, a California board-licensed psychologist and industrial and organizational behavioral psychologist. Dr. JAYN, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Pasha.
Right. Wonderful. The World Economic Forum identifies artificial intelligence, economic uncertainty, and also changing workforce expectations as some of the biggest forces reshaping jobs globally. Now, from a psychological perspective, how are these changes reshaping people's relationship with work?
I actually do not believe AI is the biggest story. The biggest story is actually the speed of change, and technology is evolving exponentially. However, human psychology is evolving biologically. So those two speeds are not the same. And for generations, people expect stability, one career, one profession, and also a very predictable future. Today's people are expected to reinvent themselves repeatedly, and also it creates what we psychologists call continuous adaptation fatigue. Our brains are wired for certainty. We cannot keep changing as quickly as technology is changing, and modern organizations need to reward adaptability. So these two realities are beginning to collide. So the future will not necessarily belong to the smartest people, I feel. It will belong to people who can learn, adapt, and recover. So we can definitely leapfrog technologically, but we must ensure our people are evolving alongside our technologies. So to summarize, I would think technology is definitely moving a lot faster than human psychology.
So it's really about, how quickly we can adapt to changes, and, changes are bound to happen. Dr. JAYN, the Microsoft 2026 Work Trend Index found that 58% of AI users say they're producing work today that they couldn't have done just a year ago. Has technology simply changed the way we work, or has it also changed what people now expect from themselves at work?
Technology has definitely changed much more than how we work. It has fundamentally changed what employers expect from people. In the past, employers hired primarily for what we knew. It could be education, training, expertise. But today, they are increasingly hiring people for how quickly they can learn. Knowledge has definitely become more accessible. AI can retrieve information in seconds, right? And so human value is therefore shifting towards judgment. So we are looking more towards critical thinking, creativity, emotional intelligence. That's a very big one, and ethical decision making. And also a huge one would be communication. So workers are now expected to collaborate with AI continuous learning and also solve increasingly complex problems and to produce more than ever before. So the expectation is no longer simply to work harder or just to meet KPI. It's to evolve continuously. So learning is no longer something we do just before we begin a career. It's something that we have to do part of the career itself.
Mhm. Right, so there's definitely a lot more that is expected from the worker now, a lot more expectations, a lot more pressures as well. Now, as organizations continue to adapt to new technologies and also the changing business demands, employees are also being asked to work differently than ever before. Now, what are organizations often overlooking about how people are actually experiencing all this change, because it is happening at a very, very quick pace?
Yes. So organizations, I feel, are definitely investing heavily in digital transformation, and many are forgetting the emotional transformation. And people rarely resist change itself. We are very capable of change. What they are resisting is actually uncertainty. They're resisting feeling excluded. They are also feeling replaceable, especially with AI. During organizational change, employees are quietly asking, usually these three questions: Am I safe, at this job? Am I safe, with this income? Am I still? Do I feel vulnerable? Do I still belong here? So if leaders do not answer those questions, what happens to employees is anxiety increases. So then trust decreases, and then engagement drops, and performance usually suffers. So people do not burn out merely because change happens. That's not what we have seen. What we see is they burn out because change never stops. So the healthiest organizations will not simply demand more resilience from their employees, they will also create genuine opportunities for recovery. So there needs to be space. So to summarize, it will be people do not resist change, they resist uncertainty, exclusion, and fear of becoming irrelevant.
Right, so it is a natural progression for people to change according to the times, but I guess a sense of security is also very, very important for most workers. As organizations continue focusing on productivity and performance, now recognizing when people are struggling may become just as important. Dr. JAYN, what are some of the warning signs that leaders often overlook before constant pressure begins affecting, both people and also performance?
So burnout does not happen overnight. It leaves a lot of clues. So what are some of the clues? People become quieter, they stop contributing ideas, their curiosity disappears. You start seeing small mistakes and they become more frequent. Decision making slows down, people become emotionally flat. So you tend to see a lot of flat affect on the face, or usually they tend to be irritable. So those are some of the signs. And so another warning sign is, are they present? People are usually at work, physically they're at work, but psychologically they've already checked out. So those are some of the things that you need to look out for. And one more serious, I would say, warning is cynicism. When people start saying, sentences like, what is the point? That tells me that they're not just simply tired, they're beginning to lose meaning at work. And so organizations often measure productivity and KPI and stuff like that. They should also pay attention to psychological well-being, because by the time performance declines and absenteeism and things like that, the psychological problem may have existed for months. So we need to look at the whispers before it starts screaming.
Right, Dr. JAYN, the World Economic Forum identifies analytical thinking, resilience, flexibility, and also lifelong learning among the most important workplace skills for the future. Now, working ahead, what personal qualities will help people not just succeed, but also stay well in tomorrow's workplace?
So I definitely agree. So I would say, let's look at this. I would say psychological flexibility. I think being able to adapt without losing your identity. People who need we definitely need people who have very good analytical thinking, but they also need emotional regulation. So we want definitely curiosity, good judgment, communication, cross-cultural collaboration, and the ability to work effectively with AI. They will need to know how to use AI. They may also need to know how to question it, because don't just believe everything that you get from AI. The future will not reward people who simply know the most, not just education, the best education. It will also reward people who ask better questions. So continuous learning, remaining adaptable, those who can stay deeply human, and let's see how with technology, we definitely also want to see people who have empathy, wisdom, I would say ethics, trust, human connection. Those are some of the qualities to remain essential.
Right. Dr. JAYN, thank you so much for sharing some of your insights. We hope to speak to you again very soon. That was Dr. JAYN Rajandran, Doctor of Psychology and Industrial Organizational Behavioral Psychologist. Up next on Point of View, I will be speaking to Steve KILLELEA AM, founder and executive chairman, Institute for Economic and Peace. We'll be diving into the 2026 Global Peace Index and what Malaysia's incredible climb means for our future. That's coming up right after this short break. Stay with us. The 2026 Global Peace Index is out. While global peace continues to decline, Malaysia is one of the standout performers this year, moving up 12 places to rank 12th in the world. Now, to help us break down the data and Malaysia's standout performance, Steve KILLELEA AM, the founder and executive chairman of the Institute for Economics and Peace, joins us from Sydney. Hi, Steve. Thank you for joining us. Now, this is the 20th edition of the Global Peace Index. What are some of the biggest takeaways from this year's reports, and what surprised you most about the state of peace in 2026?
Well, I think in many ways this year was a very sobering year, and it really comes back to the state of global conflict. So peace now has deteriorated for the last 12 years, every year. And so it's been 13 years since we had an improvement in peace. So today we've got 61 active conflicts. That's the most since the end of the Second World War. So since the inception of the index 20 years ago, we had more countries drop this year than any other year. So 99 of the 163 countries we measure deteriorated. We also look at the deaths. There are 181,000 deaths through conflict this year. That's the second highest which we've had on record. And if we also look further, we can see that there are 20 active conflicts now with more than 1,000 people killed. And again, that's the most since the inception of the index 20 years ago. So I guess from that angle, it's not very good news. But I think the thing which surprised me the most about this year would have just been the possible impact on the global economy of further deterioration in the war in Iran. And that's not so much around the Straits of Hormuz. It's more moving down and looking at the Horn of Africa, because there are 8 countries involved in a conflict cluster there. If that was to merge with the conflict cluster around the greater Middle East, what we'd have then is a situation which would be catastrophic, probably for the global economy.
Right, Steve, the report describes today's geopolitical environment as the great fragmentation. What does that mean in practical terms, and why is it making conflicts more difficult to resolve?
So we're looking at the great fragmentation. It's really what we call the rise of middle-level powers. So what we're seeing over the last 20 years, that the influence exerted by the great powers, and they're mainly European powers, is diminished. And so one way of looking at that's just the reduction in the size of their GDP as a percentage of the global economy. So for example, Germany's half what it was, let's say in 1995. We can see similar sort of fall for France. Italy's down 40%. The UK is down about 30%. Now, this means that there's now other countries are picking up that influence. And we call this the emerging middle-level power countries, which Malaysia would be one of. And so the number of middle-level powers has now doubled. And so quite often these countries are seeking to gain relevance and influence within their region. So some of the other countries which would meet the rising middle-level powers are countries like Turkey, Israel, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia. So there's some of the others. Now, if we come back to the conflicts, which we can see in the Greater Horn of Africa, you'll find a number of those countries are actually engaged in those wars as proxies. And this is what makes it very, very hard to actually stop these conflicts. So if we went back to the 1980s, 23% of conflicts stopped with a peace agreement. That had dropped to 4% in the 2010s.
Right. Malaysia has climbed to 12th globally in the 2026 Global Peace Index. Now, what stands out the most about its performance compared to other countries in Asia and around the world?
So if we look at Asia overall, there's 19 countries. Malaysia's fourth. So if we look at the top 10 countries in the world, 3 of them actually from Asia Pacific. That's New Zealand, Singapore, and Japan. And then we find Malaysia comes next, with Australia coming in 5th. Now, if we're looking over the last 5 years, what we find is there's been a substantial improvement in the Malaysian peacefulness. It's been driven mainly by improvements in the internal peacefulness and a little bit by external peace as well. But if we're looking internally within the country, what we can find, there's been a substantial drop in the number of homicides, the perceptions of crime, and violent crime. And so that's the main thing we can see for the improvements within Malaysia. If we look over the last year, however, did have a spike because of violent demonstrations. So if we're looking at that, we can find in Independence Square, there was a major demonstration there, 18 to 50,000 people. So that sort of slightly dampened what could have been a big increase in peace by Malaysia. But what I'd say, 12 on the index, you have to be very, very peaceful. And you get up to that level, that very, very small changes can actually shift countries 1 or 2 places. So whether you're 12th, 13th, 15th, 10th, it's not so important. It means it's a very peaceful country. One of the things we've found is that when countries move into this high peace bracket, it's very, very sticky. Generally, they stay there. You don't see substantial drops in peace. That's it. Yeah, that at this stage, we haven't really seen happen to any of the most peaceful countries in the world. So I think in many ways, that's great news for Malaysia.
It is, in fact. Steve, however, perhaps you could share with us which specific indicators that are driving Malaysia's very strong performance. And if we are looking to break into the world's top 10, what do we need to improve?
Well, I think if you get into the top 10, violent demonstrations, if you hadn't had any violent demonstrations, that probably would have been worth 1 or 2 more points. The level of safety and security is very, very good at the moment. It's very hard to improve much beyond where you're at. You could do that by if there's lessening of the number of people which are incarcerated, but obviously there's a relationship for reductions in crime and incarceration. But the really highly peaceful countries have very low levels of violent crime, low levels of incarceration, and low levels of homicide. So there's maybe a few areas there which could be picked up, which could pull the country up as well. But it's really a very, very good score.
Steve, your research argues that peace isn't just a social outcome, but it is also an economic asset. Now, how does Malaysia benefit economically from being one of the world's most peaceful countries?
All right, so there's a number of ways of really looking at this. I might start just with a global perspective. So if we're looking at the cost of violence to the global economy, it was $22 trillion last year. That's 10.5% of the global GDP, or put it another way, roughly $2,600 US for every person on the planet. Now, if we come back, there's qualities called positive peace, and they're the qualities which actually create a peaceful society. So countries which improve, and all the countries at the top of the index tend to be high in these qualities. So countries which are improving in positive peace have twice the GDP growth rates of countries deteriorating, foreign direct investments twice as high, interest rates and inflation rates are lower. In fact, inflation's 3 times less volatile and consumer spending's 30% higher. So that's just a little bit on the tie-in between peace and economic development. Now, if we look at the countries in the top 10, the Global Peace Index, they average something like about 3% of GDP on containing violence or are impacted by violence. So we went to the bottom of the index and looked at the bottom 10 at something like 35%. So again, that's another way of just seeing the difference in terms of the economic cost of violence.
Right, Steve. Now, earlier, we talked about what we can improve to break into the top 10 of the Global Peace Index. What are some of the biggest risks that could threaten Malaysia's peacefulness over the next 5 to 10 years? And perhaps you could share with us what policymakers should be focusing on today.
Yeah, look, I think they're very good questions. So the number of the factors are external. We can see rising tensions in the South China Sea. If those spilled over and affected Malaysia, then that may cause for a substantial drop in peace, particularly if war broke out. That'd come back and get affected by, let's say, more military expenditure, worsening relationships with neighbouring states. So they'd be the ones I'd look for there. The other kind of thing which can affect is a rise in social tensions. We can see the large demonstration which occurred last year. And that was sort of related back to the cost of living pressures, subsidy reductions, and I think increases in tax rates from memory. And so if there was more social rest or untension, that would be there. But I come back and now look at those qualities which create for peaceful societies. And those peaceful societies are also highly resilient societies, and they're societies which perform better on measures of well-being and happiness as well. So if we're coming back to it, there's a concept called positive peace, and it's basically systemic. And it looks at what are the things which actually drive a systemic change within societies to make them more peaceful, more productive, more wealthy and happier. So they come to bear them. They're things like well-functioning government, they're a strong business environment, equitable distribution of resources, acceptance of other people's rights, high levels of education, low levels of corruption, which is always important. And good relationships with neighbouring states. So all these things come together and they act as a system, and they can be measured. And at the Institute for Economics and Peace, we've got measurements on this, and we've been now tracking that again for over 20 years to be able to get a better understanding of changes over time. So countries which tend to have higher peace rankings and their positive peace suggest, we would call that a positive peace deficit. Over time, they tend to deteriorate. So it's a very, very good indicator of future peacefulness.
All right. Thank you so much, Steve, for breaking down the 2026 Global Peace Index and also Malaysia's exceptional rise. It was a pleasure having you. Stay safe, and we hope to speak to you again very soon.
Thank you. I've enjoyed being on the show.
All right, that wraps up this edition of The World. As we leave you, please, we pause to remember the victims of Malaysia Airlines flight MH17. July 17th marks the 12th anniversary of the tragedy. On this date, 12 years ago, all 298 passengers and crew were killed when the civilian aircraft was shot down over eastern Ukraine. We honor their memory and extend our thoughts to the families and loved ones who continue to bear this profound loss. Stay up to date with the latest developments from Malaysia and around the world at Bernama.com. I'm PASHA Rahim. Thanks for watching.